This is the Fujifilm X-T5. It's the latest in the line of Fuji's X-T cameras, the successor to the X-T4. And it has the 5th generation sensor and Fuji's 5th generation processor. And I've been using this for the last couple of weeks, shooting around my home city of Lisbon. So let's have a look at what this camera is like. Now I have to say, I didn't expect the camera to be launched this soon, quite so quickly after the XH2S and the XH2, which I reviewed just about a month ago and was a camera that I really liked. I think it's the first time Fuji released 3 major cameras within the same calendar year. Now the XT series is no longer being classed as their flagship line. That label belongs to the XH2 series now. But there's no doubt about it, the XT4, the XT3, these are really popular cameras. And this is probably the camera with the broadest appeal, particularly amongst existing Fuji users. So this has inherited a lot of what made the XH2 such a good camera. It's got the same 40 megapixel X-Trans5 HR high resolution sensor. It's got the same X Processor 5 and pretty much the same autofocus that you can find in the XH2. And it's got all of this in a body that's actually smaller and lighter than the XT4. However, it doesn't have everything that the flagship cameras have. It's not an XH2 with dials. Particularly on the video side of things, and I'll come to that a little bit later in the review. Now this does feel like a really well-made camera. It's really solid in the hand. It's almost all metal except for the doors. Like all of the XT cameras before it, it really does feel very well made. Now Fuji cameras have been getting progressively bigger and heavier pretty much since the XT2. This reverses that trend, which is really nice. It's actually smaller and lighter than the X-T4, weighing in at 557 grams, which is more than 100 grams lighter than the XH2. And in fact, without the battery, it weighs less than the X-T3. So Fuji have actually done a really good job of scaling down things like the image stabilization, and the internal cooling in the body, and making this a lot smaller. It feels a lot like the X-T3 in the hand and much smaller than something like the XH2. And that's something that I really like. I really do like the small feel of it, because it was the smaller size of the cameras, which is one of the things that attracted me to the Fuji system in the first place. Now the fact that it's smaller and lighter may put off people who've got bigger hands, because you can't really wrap your hand around the grip like you can a camera like the XH2. You can't really get your hand around it. But I have been carrying this around for more than a week, and it does feel really good in the hand. It never feels loose. It feels pretty solid. You can get all of your fingers around it. I've got, I would say, relatively medium-sized hands, and the grip is really quite comfortable to me. Certainly the same as something like the X-T4 or the X-T3 or any of the XT series cameras. The grip is a slightly different shape to the X-T4. It's not quite so deep and a little bit kind of wider with a slightly different cut, but I didn't really notice any difference to the way that it feels in the hand. And of course it is weather sealed like all of the XT series before it. Now I've not had a chance to really push the weather sealing, to really test it out. It's not really been raining enough where I live, but I've been using Fuji cameras for 7 or 8 years now. I've never had a problem with the weather sealing, so I really don't see that this is going to be any different. It does feel like a very well-made camera. In terms of the controls and dials, it is exactly the same as the X-T4, with everything in the same place. The only difference that I've noticed is that on the back, or on the display back button, there's now a small Bluetooth symbol. But apart from that, every button is in exactly the same place. So if you're used to using the X-T4, then you're just going to be able to use this seamlessly. It's an incredibly intuitive camera to use, which is part of the attraction, I think, of a lot of Fuji cameras since the X-T1. It has the same joystick as the X-T4, not the joystick from the XH2, which is one of the things about the controls of the camera that I really didn't like. I do much prefer this joystick. And both the command dials on the front and back are now clickable, so you can use those as a function button as well. So if you like the feel of the analog controls and the dials on cameras like the X-T4, then obviously this is something that you're going to like and perhaps prefer over the XH2. The dials are a slightly different shape. They feel a little bit taller, but pretty much exactly the same as the X-T4, and it has kept this switch on underneath the shutter button here, where you can switch it between video mode and movie mode, which is something that I really did like about the X-T4, and I'm glad they've kept that. if you do prefer to shoot with the controls like on the XH2 with the PSAM dial, then you can actually set this up to shoot in the same way. I've been using the GFX a lot recently, which doesn't have these analog dials. It's a PSAM control camera. And what I've done and what you can do with this is you can set the front dial to ISO. You just put the ISO dial here onto C, and then you can control the ISO through this dial in the front. You put the shutter dial to T, and then you control the shutter speed at the back, all the way from 60 minutes all the way up to, I think it's 1/8000, and then the aperture is controlled with the dial on the lens. Now the LCD screen is a return to the three-way articulating screen that you found on cameras like the X-T3 and that you can find on something like the GFX, which is something that I do really like. If you're a landscape photographer like me and you have an L bracket on the camera, and then you find yourself often shooting in vertical mode with the camera in the L bracket, the flip around screens are very difficult to use, and it's very difficult. You have to have it flat on the back of the camera. It's very difficult to get the flip around screen out and get them interacting well with the L bracket and the tripod head. So I'm actually quite happy to see a return to this three-way articulating screen. It is something that I do prefer, and I find it a lot more useful. However, if you're shooting videos like this, then that flip around screen really is useful, but that's really the major use of it. Now the LCD itself is the same size as on the X-T4. It's a 3-inch screen. Now according to the spec sheet that Fuji sent me, there has been a slight increase in the resolution of the LCD screen. The EVF though, the electronic viewfinder, has the same 3.69 million dot resolution that you find in the X-T4. So it doesn't have the really nice EVF that you find in the XH2 series. Now that's a shame. I really do like the EVF in the XH2. It's something that you really notice when you put your eye against a viewfinder, particularly, you saw the detail, particularly when you zoomed into images. But I do understand Fuji needed to cut costs and save costs somewhere, and it's something that they've always done. Fuji have pretty much put the entire image processing system from the XH2, from their flagship cameras in here, the same sensor, the same processor, the same autofocus. But I do understand that Fuji had to cut costs somewhere. So I would like that higher resolution EVF, but at the same time, I'd like that same high resolution EVF in the GFX. This has the same EVF that you'll find in the GFX 100S, and it's good enough for that camera, then it's definitely good enough for this. The doors, all of the doors do actually feel a little bit more solid than on the X-T4, and you've got all of the same connections here. You've got the 2 SD card slots, so that's another difference that you'll find from the XH2. It doesn't have a CF Express slot, and it's that lack of a CF Express which does limit it from a lot of the top specs that the XH2S has. Things like the 720 megabits per second data transfer, which is why you can have ProRes video, which is why you have the really fast frame rates on the XH2 that you don't get with this. Now these are really high functions that I think that the majority of people don't really need in their photography, and CF Express cards are quite expensive. So personally I prefer having the 2 SD card slots just for overflow, for backup, and having the 2 similar slots and being able to interchange them. Now like the X-T4, it's got a micro HDMI socket, not the full size one that you can find on the XH2. Now again, it's these kind of small things which differentiate these cameras from the top level, from the flagship cameras. I don't mind that at all. One thing that does irritate me just a little bit is that the remote for the camera remote is back here on the left side of the camera. On the X-T3 and on the GFX and also on the XH2 cameras, they put the remote on the right side of the camera. Again, that's something that matters when you have the camera in an L bracket, in vertical, on a tripod. Being able to access that camera remote socket is something that I really do like, and it just annoys me that after putting it on their recent cameras on this side of the camera, they switched it back to this. So despite being a little bit smaller in the body, the camera does have 5-axis image stabilization, and it's actually a little bit improved over the X-T4, which has 6.5 stops. This does have 7 stops of image stabilization. Now what that actually means and how big of an improvement that is, how big an improvement half a stop makes over the X-T4, I don't think it's really noticeable. But image stabilization really does make a difference to when you're shooting either photos or video handheld. You can see here it allows you to get shots at a much lower shutter speed than you normally can. For example, I was able to get sharp shots with a 35mm at half a second, or here using a telephoto at 200mm at 1/25, which is just something you can't do without image stabilization. Now, the autofocus is the same super snappy autofocus that you'll find in the X-H2 with face recognition and with different subject recognition. You can set the settings for it to recognize different subjects and lock on. I found it really, really useful. I'm by no means an expert on autofocus. I'm a landscape photographer. Most of what I shoot is relatively stationary, and I tend to use manual focus a lot of the time. But when I've been using this camera and when I was using the X-H2 New York, I was very impressed with the autofocus. It really does quickly recognize faces, recognize the eye in the face, and then track it across the frame, really sticking with it, even if there's a lot going on in the frame, even if it's very busy. It really does feel to me like a very good autofocus system, and quite a big step up from what I was using on the X-T4. Now, it has the same battery that you'll find in the X-T4 and the X-H2 and the GFX, but Fuji are advertising quite a big improvement in performance when it comes to still photography. So they're saying that you can get 740 shots out of it in economy mode, which is about a 25% increase on the same battery in the X-T4, and almost double what you could get with a camera like the X-T3, which had the older battery. Now, I found the battery life in this camera to be seriously impressive. I went out shooting with it on the first afternoon, shot all day, and then did a few shots in the evening, and there was still more than half of the battery left. I think that you can easily, as a landscape photographer, this is easily going to get me through an entire day of photography without any problem at all on just the one battery. I really have been impressed at how much performance Fuji have been managing to squeeze out of this battery. So what I suspect a lot of people are going to be looking at in this camera is the big jump in resolution and the new 40 megapixel sensor. Now, Fuji cameras have kind of been stuck in the mid 20 megapixels pretty much since the X-T2. So it is a big jump. It is a big leap in resolution. And like the X-H2, it's the largest resolution that you can find in an APS-C camera. Now, what does it actually mean in real terms? 26 megapixels is probably enough for most people's needs. This print that you can see behind me is 1 meter wide, and it was shot with the 24 megapixel X-T2. The 40 megapixel sensor does give you a lot more space if you want to crop into images. If you're the kind of person that really likes zooming into images and seeing all the detail there, then you're really going to like the increase in resolution. And it does give you bigger prints. If you're printing at about 250 dpi or something like 100 pixels per centimeter, then this has got 7,700 pixels along the longest edge, which is going to give you prints of about 80 centimeters along the longest edge, which is about 25% bigger than you could get with something like the X-T4, which was at about 6,000 something pixels along the longest edge. And 80 centimeters is a big print. It only takes a little bit of work in Photoshop, and you can get meter-wide prints from a camera like this, which is really quite impressive. But anyway, let's have a look at some of the shots that I've done with this camera and the kind of image quality that you can expect from that 40 megapixel sensor. So let's have a look at a couple of images that I've shot with the X-T5. So these first two here, these are done with the X-T5 and the XS10, just to show the difference between the 40 megapixel sensor and the 26 megapixel sensor. Now, like this, just looking at the screen, you really can't see, but when you zoom in to 100%, then the image on the left, this is the X-T5, everything is much bigger there. So there's just so many more pixels on the door. So both are zoomed into the same, they're both zoomed into 100%, but you can zoom in much further to a file with a higher resolution. Everything just has a lot more, basically a lot more pixels, so you're just resolving more detail. Now, there's not really a lot of point in comparing sharpness or anything like that, because they're both taken with the same lens at the same settings, so the sharpness should actually be the same. It's just that every single element, there are just so many more pixels, so you can zoom into the image a lot deeper than you can with a 26 megapixel image. So this is a shot with the X-T5 with the 1024. Now the 1024 isn't one of the lenses that Fuji is saying is optimized for the 40 megapixel sensor. I'm going to put a list up on the screen of the lenses that are optimized. Now, that doesn't mean that you're not going to see an improvement. You are going to get obviously quite a lot of that resolution, but they're not going to be resolving all of the detail from the sensor. Now, it's not that the lenses that are not optimized, it's not that they don't work or that they're going to look bad. It's just that you don't get the absolute full benefits of all of those megapixels that the sensor has. But still, the image does look really good. You're going to resolve a lot more detail than you would normally. So we can just see here, zooming in to 100%. Let's just zoom in a little bit deeper there. So you can see the writing on this box and how much detail is being resolved there. When we zoom out, you can see how much of the image that is. If we have a look at this image, this is a very detail heavy image. If we zoom in there, you can just see the huge amount of detail that's being resolved all the way down the street, through the washing on the side, the railings, the different signposts, the electric cables above the tram. You really can zoom in a long way to this image and get lots and lots of detail, which means you can also crop into the images and still keep a very high resolution, a very high detail image. Now, I think one of the concerns about high resolution cameras is having those higher pixel densities on the sensor, having more pixels on the sensor, can sometimes mean that the light gathering capabilities of the pixels is less, so you don't get quite the same performance at high ISOs. So let's have a look again at the two cameras here. So now these two images were taken at ISO 2000 with the 26 megapixel XS10 on the left and the 40 megapixel sensor, the X-T5, on the right. Now, what you're going to be seeing on the screen is very different to what I'm looking at here, because it's going to be through a render video and then compressed for upload to the internet for YouTube. So you're not going to be seeing the same amount of detail that I'm seeing. But already zooming in, I think you can see that there is a little bit more noise in the X-T5. The detail is still extremely good, and obviously we're zoomed in further with the X-T5 because it has more resolution. But I think when we look deep into the shadows here across the ceiling, the XS10 does feel a little bit cleaner. Let's just look over here. It's not a huge amount of difference. It is very similar. There's more shadows over on this side. It's relatively small, but I would say that the XS10 has slightly better noise performance than the X-T5. This is at ISO 4000 again, so let's zoom in. Here, I don't think the difference is quite as marked. They do look very similar. I do think both cameras perform quite well. I think just looking in the corner here around these books, a little bit more noise on the X-T5, but it's hard to tell because, again, we're zoomed in further with the X-T5. It is still very good. There's lots of definition, lots of detail. The color rendition is still quite nice. But I think when you look in the backing on the shadows, the noise performance, the grain is a little bit bigger. It's less fine on the X-T5 than it is on the on the smaller sensor. Now, this is an image that I just wanted to look at for the dynamic range. You can see it's a high dynamic range scene. There's a lot of highlights on the Parliament building in the background, but because it's taken in strong daylight, the foreground, the shadows in the foreground has gone very, very dark. Now, the camera has still captured all of the dynamic range. There's just, you can see here where these blue spots are, there's just a few shadows that are clipping there. But for the most part, in a very high dynamic range scene, the camera has really not done a very bad job at all. It does have quite a wide dynamic range, certainly on a par with the X-T4. It certainly feels like it in my shooting. So let's have a look though at shadow recovery. So let's just zoom into the image and just see what happens when we pull the shadows all the way back. We'll go all the way up to 100. And you can see that's really not that bad. There's still quite a lot of detail there. Now, we've lost a little bit of contrast, but that's something that you can put in, and a little bit of the color, which is when you've pulled the shadows that far, then that's actually inevitable. But the image hasn't started to fall down. There's very little noise. There's very little degradation. Here, where I think the shadows were at their darkest, it actually does look very good. So the dynamic range here, the amount of tonal information that the camera is capturing is really quite impressive. Now, of course, these are all raw images. The camera does have all of Fuji's film simulations if you prefer to shoot JPEG, including the new nostalgic neg, which I think is a really nice film simulation. It's really nice colors. Seems a little bit tiny desaturated and low contrast, but it looks great for portraits. Now, this definitely isn't a stills orientated camera. It is a hybrid camera with incredibly good video capabilities, an improvement on what you will find on the X-T4. It isn't quite as good as the X-H2. It doesn't have all of those high-end features, most notably 8K recording. Now, this isn't due to the lack of the CF Express card. When I had the X-H2, I was shooting 8K onto the SD card. What I suspect it is the smaller body makes it harder to keep the camera cool. The X-H2 has a much wider body with better cooling system, which allows it to keep the camera cooler when it's recording 8K, because the sensor does get very hot. And what I suspect is that if this camera had 8K video recording, it would get hot very quickly and would only be able to shoot 5 or 10 minutes or so of 8K video. So Fuji have decided to leave it out. You also don't get ProRes and you don't get F-Log2, and that's probably because of the lower transfer rates. You don't get the 720 megabits per second that you get on the X-H2 because you don't have the CF Express card. But the X-T5 still has some really quite impressive video specs. It shoots 6.2K at 30 frames per second. And while most people are still going to be using a 4K timeline, having 6.2K does give you a lot of flexibility when shooting video, because it gives you different focal lengths. You can crop into the video, which essentially expands the focal range of whatever lens that you're using. And it's also very helpful if you're stabilizing shaky video in post, because again, you can crop in. And it's also got 4K 60 frames per second. Slightly different transfer rate to the X-T4. This maxes out at 360 megabits per second. The X-T4 at 400. I don't really know why that is, but I don't really think it makes that much difference. Of course, it can shoot in F-Log, which is really nice if you want to grade your own footage. It gives you much wider, much broader dynamic range. There's a lot more data in the files, which is just really great when you're grading. If you want to bring out the most of the color and the contrast in the files and bring out all of the data that you're recording there. But you can also shoot in Fuji's film simulation modes, which are really nice. Things like the Eterna are really nice. Classic Chrome looks really good, and this does have a new film simulation nostalgic negative, which I think looks really nice. This then is probably the camera that a lot of Fuji users wanted. It's got the same classic analog controls and feel that you find on the previous XT series cameras, yet it's reversed that trend of the bodies getting bigger and heavier. This is actually a smaller and lighter body than the X-T4 and significantly smaller than the X-H2, but it does have a lot of the really good features of the X-H2. You've got that same 40 megapixel sensor, you've got the same big improvement in autofocus, you've got the same improvements in IBIS, the improvements in video performance, and the improvements in battery life. So it is quite a big step up, quite a big upgrade, I think, from the X-T4. And then, of course, you've got the articulating screen on the back, which I think quite a lot of photographers are going to enjoy, if not so much videographers. But it doesn't have everything that the X-H2 has. You're going to miss out on some of the top end of the specs. Things like the 8K video, the capacity to record ProRes or F-Log2, and some of those really high frame rates that you get from a CF Express card. But those are things which I personally, in my shooting, never really noticed. They're things that I'm perfectly happy to live without. And I think if you're looking at choosing this camera, deciding between this camera and the X-H2, those are the things that you're going to look at, as well as how comfortable you are, how much you like the styling and the analog controls of this camera. But for me, this is a really wonderful camera that fulfills all my needs professionally, and certainly the best XT series camera that there's been, and this is the camera that I'm going to be upgrading to sit side by side with my GFX. Now, I think that's pretty much it for this video. I hope it's been interesting and I hope it's been useful. If you've got any questions at all, just drop a comment below or send me an email and I will get back to you. Now, if you enjoy my style of shooting, if you enjoy my photography, I'd love to have you join me on a workshop. I run workshops all around the world in some really incredible locations, and I'm just about to launch my workshops for 2024. I'll be returning to Namibia. There'll be a workshop in Patagonia, as well as workshops in Iceland, in the Highlands, in Norway, and in the Dolomites, as well as Greenland. Now, if there's anything that you're interested in, you can find full details on my website, or just drop me a line and I'll get back to you, and I'd love to see you on a workshop. So as ever, thanks so much for watching. Thanks for supporting the channel, and good luck with all your photography. See ya.